and welcome to this edition of Trader Hawk TV. Today we got Joe from Permutive in the office. Joe,
hey,
how are you?
Good, thank you.
Thanks for coming in. And today Joe's going to talk about the hidden web. What is the hidden web? Well, we know that Apple have been going pretty hard on the privacy piece, ITP and the rest, and we know that that has affected ad tech as a whole and publishers. So today Joe's here to talk about sort of how that can be remedied and talking about how his product works within that environment. So Joe, talk a bit about the hidden web. It's an interesting phrase because obviously Apple have gone fairly aggressive on the privacy piece, the ITP piece, ITP 1.0 and now 2.0, yes. Trying to block third-party cookies and improving privacy. Yeah. But let's just say what effect that's had on the web.
Yeah, so
because obviously Apple's got massive market share in mobile and desktop.
Yeah, of course. So kind of what we found is there's been this huge shift in industry towards programmatic advertising over like the past 10 years or so. And the entirety of that ecosystem is driven on top of third-party cookies. Mm-hmm. Third-party cookies have become the tool which allows people to move data around and to make good decisions on what ads they're buying. And what we started to see around 5 or 6 years ago was these third-party cookies slowly disappearing. And the first wave of this came with kind of very privacy-conscious ad blockers coming in and getting rid of third-party cookies. And then we saw this enormous shift in the industry, which was Apple and ITP1 starting to block third-party cookies. And over time, Apple had become more and more stringent on this, and more browsers have also started following suit and kind of copying what Apple are doing. And what we've seen is us go from 100% of the web working with third-party cookies to now something which looks like somewhere between 50 and 60% of the internet.
So this entire ecosystem now is basically 50% in the US, is that right?
Yeah, so we have numbers which around 50% of US traffic is coming in on browsers which are blocking third-party cookies, right. Which means those users are entirely invisible in programmatic. You can't even do kind of frequency capping, let alone using data to target those users.
So what does that mean for buyers then? I mean, does that mean that they're just basically buying random impressions and there's no real ROI?
Yeah, so what we've seen is that buyers start to spend a lot less money on ad impressions which they can't value accurately, which means two things. One is that they're wasting money, often because they don't know who they're targeting outside of just context. And then the second is for publishers, they've seen their CPMs massively in decline as a result of this. And I think kind of we saw a lot of chat early on about kind of mobile CPMs, but really now that is kind of spread out in the sense that without data, we're seeing a lot of CPMs start to crash on these browsers.
So is this the end of the third-party cookie? So you see a lot of sort of like death notices for the third-party cookie. But yeah. Is this the end of the cookie though? Like because like there's a distinction between cookies, obviously the first-party cookie and the third-party cookie. Yeah. I'd like you to sort of just jot this out in the board.
Yeah, of course.
I would love to know the difference between the two because obviously there's been a huge sort of like privacy push and the third-party cookie's been affected, but still the first-party cookie is still there.
Yeah, of course. So if we kind of start with where this all kind of kicks off, which is in the user's web browser. So over here, this is kind of the user's browser. A user will go to a site. So in this case, let's say they go to publisher.com. So over here, like when a user hits this website, what ends up happening is a network request gets made to publisher.com's web server. So over here we have the publisher.com web server, and the user's browser is making a request to this. So this request comes in, and in return, publisher.com will return that page. So traditionally this would be like an article, right? Now in this interaction, what the web server here can do is set a cookie for this user. So let's say that this cookie is set as ID equals ABC. Now what is going to happen is when this comes back to the browser, it's going to be stored within the browser. So over here we now have like cookie ID equals ABC. And every time the user's browser now communicates with the publisher's server, we're going to see this attached to it. So over here you now have this perfect sequence. And this is a first-party cookie, right? The user's gone to publisher.com and the cookie's been set by publisher.com. It's how Facebook allows you to log in. It's how kind of the modern internet has been built, and it's a really fundamental tool within it. So this is kind of like, when we talk about the death of the cookie, I think people are in general talking about the death of the third-party cookie, which is slightly different. And this is where kind of when a publisher is running ads on their site, say here, and a request is made out to a third party, in this case, let's say exchange.com, over here, Exchange.com will likely do exactly the same thing which the publisher did. So when a network request is made to them, they're going to say, hey, let's set a cookie. And in this case, we might say ID equals 123. And in this case now, we're going to store a new cookie within here, which is ID equals 123. But importantly, because the user's on publisher.com, but the network request is made to exchange.com, this is third-party cookie.
Okay.
So same fundamental underlying technology, but it's the context within which it's being read.
So let's put this in a kind of a programmatic sort of context, right? So obviously third-party cookies are important for cookie matching and the ability to programmatically serve ads on a page, right? So if you have a publisher just setting a first-party cookie, it makes it difficult to sort of get that out to potential buyers and cookie matchers. So how can this be done at scale? So let's just say that you work with sort of a food site, right? You know, popular recipes, all the rest of it, and that site has constant users because they're obviously going back to cook for the family or whatever else, and now that first party gets served, but served on the user's browser. But the thing is, you want to obviously extend it out to the market. So how do they manage and activate that data for the greater market? Is this where your product comes into play?
So what we kind of saw was, yes, that is very much where Permutive comes into play. But I suppose that the first way in which publishers did this in this prior ecosystem, which accepts these third-party cookies, is almost exactly the same way as everyone else was doing it. So to your point on cookie matching, like in that world, what would happen is downstream, you have like your DSP, and then this DSP, which belongs to an advertiser, and then this DSP will connect into probably like that advertiser or agency's DMP, and it will also connect into third-party data.
Quite the chain.
Exactly, really quite the chain. And all this data, the way in which it's being transferred, is along these cookies. So here we're passing in this same one of ID equals 123, and here we have ID equals 123. And here we have ID equals 123. And then down here, what the advertiser is doing a cookie match on this ID 123 to hook it up with the DMP, which will have ID equals 123, into the third-party data provider, ID equals 123, or even using that third-party cookie over here to pull in second-party data from the publisher, which will be ID equals 123. And all these IDs are these third-party cookie IDs. And then what happened was Apple came in and Apple said, hey, this third-party cookie ID, like we don't accept it anymore. And then this disappeared, and then this disappeared, and then this disappeared, and this, and this, and this. And now all of a sudden, the algorithms in here, which have become so comfortable using all this data to value an ad, can't value that ad anymore. And that whole ecosystem just collapses in on itself. And rather than what would traditionally happen, which is a DSP might return a £5 bid on the exchange, the publisher receives £5 and is over the moon. Instead, now this £5 becomes something more like 10p. And downstream, like the publisher's like, holy shit, like my ad revenue's kind of collapsed in on itself, even though I'm still taking part in this ecosystem. So I'm still providing this data. So what we found is like, hey, the publisher, like in this world, this ID equals ABC hasn't disappeared, right? The publisher still has that ability to track that user and see that user. It's just that the publisher needs to change the way in which they send that data over to this side of the ecosystem. And is that possible? And that is kind of where Permutive came into play, was like, we recognize that this shift in the ecosystem has some pretty dramatic effects, because downstream, all of a sudden this third-party data can't be used anymore, second-party data can't be used, the DMP data can't be used, and over here this has nothing to make any decisions on, but over here the publisher has a load of data. So in an ecosystem which relies entirely on data, the publisher now is the only one who holds that data.
So how does your product work? How do you take all this juicy first-party data and turn it into something that can be used in a compliant way, privacy, GDPR, etc., to allow buyers to buy and obviously increase the yield for publishers in terms of revenue?
It's a really good question. So the first piece is, how do you collect that data? So for us as a company, we've always operated as if we were a publisher. So we've always been entirely kind of first party by design. So it's much like we're a database for publishers. So what that has meant for our publishers is that we end up using their first-party cookie. And in a world of ITP 1, in a world of ITP 2, in a world of ITP 2.1, this method of setting a cookie is not blocked. So for our publishers, what it means is that we can persist a user's ID, so we can persist that user ID ABC. We then collect all the data around those users' engagements for our publishers, and that could be anything from every single ad impression and ad click, through to video plays, through to the metadata on the page. And with that, publishers will build out segments. So for example, if I know that a user is reading vegan recipes, I may put that user after a couple of recipe reads into vegan segment. So now within the user's browser, I know, hey, this user belongs in the segment equals vegan, for example. Then the question becomes, how does the publisher make this available in a programmatic ecosystem, right? In a world where there are no cookies, what do you do? And this is where we see the use of this network request here as a way of then transferring that information into the rest of the ecosystem in a privacy compliant way. So here, although a cookie saying ID equals 123 can't be provided, there can be a little bit of data which says, hey, this user belongs in the segment vegan. And now all of a sudden, all the data a publisher has about a user can be attached to the ad request made to the exchange without that user's ID ever being exposed. And now over here on the buyer side, all of a sudden there's visibility on half of the internet, which they didn't have before. But in the current ecosystem, what it requires is for our publishers to have a direct relationship with that advertiser. And what we're seeing is that as third-party data disappears, as second-party data disappears, and first-party DMPs for advertisers stop working, there is this flight now to having to work directly with publishers if you want to have meaningful data. And right now, the main way in which this is activated is on the PMP and in private kind of programmatic ecosystems. But our hope is that over time, this will also shift into the open.
So is a buyer then buying that user on a segment basis, you can basically extrapolate fairly sort of granular information around first party activity on the site. So, yes. But are buyers happy to buy that way, or are you training behaviour, or is it a case that given the way the GDPR has affected the industry, and given the way that people have had to kind of almost change how they buy, that this is the natural progression, particularly for programmatic, because it used to be a case of easy cookie matching all the way down the line, and you've got companies like yourself and potentially others who are kind of reframing the buying process, right? So you need to start thinking in a first party world and a compliant world as opposed to the way things were.
Yeah. So I think what we saw a couple of years back is a few agencies started to think a lot more about publishers' first party data. And we saw this with a couple of our publishers, people like Immediate Media, for example. We found that advertisers were willing to go direct to them to get access to data which they know they couldn't find elsewhere. And part of the value in that transaction at that point in time was like, hey, like third-party data, we generally don't know how on earth it is made up. So if you say, hey, I have an auto-intender, it is very unclear how the third-party data provider is actually building that segment, or if it's accurate at all. So a common complaint we hear is like, hey, like an agency wants to target CEOs with third-party data. There are like 20,000 of them. It's very unlikely that there are 20,000 CEOs reading my site. Like, how are they getting this? And then the agency doesn't trust it, and it becomes a bit messy. So we saw an initial push to first-party data because it was more trustworthy. You could go to a publisher, they would tell you exactly how it's built. But as this has all started to kick in, what it's also meant for agencies who are slightly ahead of that curve is, hey, actually, if I want data on half of the internet, I really do have to go and transact with publishers.
So just to get this straight, then, because if Apple has blocked any third-party cookies, then what about measurement pixels and conversion pixels? So if they buy, like you're obviously working with publishers on a management activation and data activation and management, right? So you're taking all of the cool information on a first-party basis, you're building segments around it, you're making it available to the actual rest of the ecosystem. Yeah. But if advertiser DSP1 buys your segment and buys an ad on the page, and they can't have a conversion pixel, how do they prove the ROI? And obviously, if they can't do that, then that price remains the same clearly. Yeah. So are you fixing that problem as well?
So what we've seen is our publishers starting to work more closely with the end advertiser. So in this ecosystem, if someone clicks, the way in which to track that conversion is to then see that user on the other end. Say if that user goes to branda.com, when that user arrives on branda.com, you want to fire off a pixel saying that user is converted. Now, right now, if branda.com is unwilling to work with a publisher, all they will know is that users have converted, but they aren't going to be able to tie it back to all the ads that users saw beforehand. If they work directly with the publisher, then they can tie back all their advertising on the publisher's site back to that conversion on branda.com.
But is Brand dropping a pixel here? And if so, how will that work when it's a third-party cookie over here?
So branda.com in this ecosystem can't fire a pixel.
Right.
Because they fire the pixel, but there's no third-party cookie.
Yeah.
So they have no idea who that user is.
Yeah.
So really the only person who can do frequency capping and knows how many impressions the user has seen within this context is publisher.com.
Right.
They're the only one who has that ability to do that. And importantly, they're the only person who has the ability to then link those ad impressions through to conversion on branda.com.
Okay, right. So in terms of sort of the uptake and success of this so far, I mean, you're working with some large publishers here in the UK and US. Has there been a shift in the way that programmatic's been bought and sold? I mean, is it fundamentally changed now from what you've seen since you started the company and now sort of we're in the GDPR shite, basically?
So we've seen pretty dramatic changes in the ecosystem. So I think the most obvious thing when we arrived, which was a problem with programmatic, which our publishers spoke about, was, hey, I'll set up a PMP, but it doesn't have scale.
Yeah.
And everyone would complain about the scale. The advertiser say, hey, I didn't see scale in your private marketplace. And the publisher would be like, well, I set it up for scale. And there was this disconnect on why this was happening. I think what we've started to see in industry is people actually understand why that has happened. And that the issues in scale people talk about as match rate issues are actually issues to do with ITP and Apple blocking the internet. And what that has meant is we've seen programmatic in a private marketplace or private environment evolve to be much more first-party data-centric. And that has been a big shift which we've seen in the industry.
And is there like, obviously Chrome hasn't gone 100% down this route, but are you seeing sort of like when you first saw the ITP stuff happen in Apple, did you see a massive drop off, and has it come back much? Because it's interesting to see, the likes of Criteo who have, who are retargeting monkeys effectively. No offense, Criteo, but you are. They have been hit hard by the Safari ITP sort of lockdown. Yeah. So when you first saw that happen, was there a massive decline in the Apple ecosystem, and are we now seeing sort of an upturn in that trend?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what we initially saw was a drop in bid density. So when Apple came in and effectively blocked third-party cookies, we just saw far less bids coming in on individual users, and over time we've seen those CPMs decline to the point now that Safari ecosystem can almost be bought on like a flat rate CPM. It's a very different world to what it was when we initially arrived. Right.
And is it more brand spend? Is this more about reach and frequency rather than performance ROI? Because it's obviously without the third party cookie, it gets a little bit more trickier to measure the conversion.
So I think initially what we saw in that first wave was mainly brand buys. Yeah. So if you look when we first came into the ecosystem. But as this has started to become a bigger and bigger issue, we've seen it shift towards performance buys for exactly the reason you were saying before, where our publishers can work now directly with an advertiser and say, hey, we're going to use the 50% of the internet we can actually see. We're going to take those users from you and use them as a sample to figure out users who look like them within our site, and then we're going to buy those users for you. And all of a sudden, where you could only see 50% of our users, now you can see 100% of them and buy on 100% of them. And that is done on a performance basis. And we see really strong results now when publishers are better collaborating with advertisers and agencies.
But how did they actually join that up? I'm just curious. Yeah. I'm just wondering how this person who is a vegan, right, goes to a vegan health store and buys a shake. I don't know what vegans do. They buy shakes. Who knows what they do?
So what you can do is when a user clicks here, they're going to be redirected through to the brand site, right? Yeah. So they are going to go over here to branda.com.
Yeah.
Now, what a publisher can do in this setting is over here they have ID equals ABC. So on the network request which is made over here, they can attach ID equals ABC to this. And now when the user comes over here in the user's web browser, we now know that this user's ID equals ABC. And the reason why is they just put it into the URL. So here when you go to branda.com, it's ID equals ABC.
Okay.
Almost like the UTM.
Right. So he's basically passing it in the actual URL itself.
Exactly. And now you can.
But what about the cookie window? Can you do post view in this as well? Like obviously if the user goes from here, then to the BBC to the Guardian, but then because of this site ends up buying within a.
No, that is a really good point. No, you can't.
All right, so the old classic post view is out the window.
Yeah. And also, like, it's really important to note, right, that it is correct that you can't do that because the user has said, "Hey, I don't want that. I don't believe that is privacy compliant."
Right.
And Apple have said that as well. Is respecting what the user has requested from a privacy perspective.
Okay, so there is a good way to do from click to actually conversion to actually track the user.
Yeah.
And is that working for publishers? Are you seeing, because of the granularity of the first party data, are you seeing more conversions from the actual site to the conversion?
Yeah, so we're seeing really strong results. So a lot of kind of publishers over here, like stylists down the road, are already seeing fantastic results from working much more closely with the end advertiser and agency. I think it requires, though, a shift on this side of the ecosystem that actually publishers need to be better included in that whole planning and buying process.
Yeah.
And that isn't going to happen overnight, but we're seeing early signs of that.
Okay. So what's the next step? Is this is there, like, obviously this is mobile web, but do you have products elsewhere? I mean, what's the next step for you guys?
Yeah. So for a long time we've just been focused on this problem for publishers of, hey, how do we fix data with respect to advertising and ad revenue? What we're seeing now in the ecosystem is actually a much broader spread of diversification. So we're seeing a lot of our publishers move into subscription, into e-commerce, into areas which they weren't in previously.
Yeah.
And what we found is data underpins so much of that. So if I'm making a move into subscription, actually the same way in which I was segmenting and targeting a user for advertising is equally as important when I'm trying to get a user to convert on my subscription or buy one of my e-commerce products. And
likewise with the subscription, because the affiliate business is quite big for traditional publishers.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Affiliate has been huge for a lot of traditional publishers. So increasingly what we're finding is that Permutive can solve these problems, and a lot of our publishers are using our customer data infrastructure to do that. So a big thing for us has been helping publishers with revenue diversification. The other big product push for us is better helping connecting our publishers and our agencies. So publishers need to be able to speak in the language of agencies and use the insights and the tools which they're used to. So we've been building a lot of analytics products to help our publishers better have this conversation too.
All right, Joe. Well, thanks for that deep dive. Great to understand the hidden web and how it's not all lost. The first party cookie lives and the cookie remains strong in the industry. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time on Trade Talk TV.